Today, we are going to talk about defining our models and why it is so important, utilizing two key things: edge highlighting and framing. I'm Khan, and you are watching The Wrath of Minis. Why is it so important for us to define our models? Firstly, miniatures are indeed, miniature, which means that they are small. And because they are small, and there's lots of little details on them, it is important for us as the painter to create visual distinction between each and all the elements that exist on that model. Partly we're doing it so we're making it easier for us to read the miniature from distance. Now, the two techniques that we are utilizing to do this are indeed framing, which is effectively us making a darker line around each element, which allows us to help visually separate each piece, and also in conjunction using edge highlighting, which we will then place a higher, brighter color on around the edges. These two things together create a really nice contrast of sort of black line, which is the framing, and a bright color, which is the edge highlighting, allows for easier distinction of all the elements that exist on a mini. So let's get into the specifics of what framing is. Framing is also called dark lining or lining. I like the term framing better because what we are doing, all you're doing is around each element, be it panels of armor, around weapons, around skin, between skin and something else like a sword handle, we are creating a dark line that separates the two different elements. This dark lining, this framing, is us effectively placing a darker color line in between two different elements. And that's really all it is. But it's important to do it because it creates separation between each of these elements. So a question that might immediately come to mind is, what do I outline? And I hate to say it, but it's going to be everything. Absolutely every single thing that you can outline, you should. What we are doing is creating visual distinction. The more we do it, the easier it is for our eyes, especially from distance, to understand what is happening in the model. It's a process, obviously. You have to grow to do it, and you gotta do more of it, and it'll become easier and easier. And I'm gonna explain tips on how you can achieve those things. If you're gonna not do all of the framing elements to it, then obviously you wanna do to the parts which are most obvious or the places that our eyes are more naturally focused towards. So towards the face is definitely an important place. If it's big paneled armor, I would definitely just do it across all the panels because they're big and you want to create that distinction. Places that are in shadows, you can obviously hide from it, so you don't need to do it quite as much there. But it's a worthwhile skill, practicing, developing, and doing rather than not doing, if I could say, So let's get to the tips about framing a model. You might initially think that you want to use black as your color, black being shadow. Black is a great line separator between different things, and I'm going to tell you, you probably should avoid black. Black is going to be much more cartoonish in its effect. Doesn't mean it's not wrong, it's just that it depends on what style you're looking for. If you're looking for a more cartoon, anime kind of thing, black lines will absolutely do the trick. The better way to think about it in terms of what color should I use to outline everything is, what is a dark color that exists between the two different elements? So if it's going to be a sword handle and a hand, for instance, probably a dark brown would work best then, because dark brown could be the undercolor of the skin. The handle itself might be, say, a red handle, then dark brown would also fit between it because the dark brown can work between both those colors. So you're kind of looking for a color that sits in between the colors that you're looking at and finding a dark version of it. So you can take a color and add black, mixing it down, just not using pure black. Here are several ways in which we can frame. First way is we could use a very sharp paintbrush, probably in the 00 territory. So very, very small, very, very fine. Something that we might use on our eyes and stuff like that, because we need to have really tight control here. And this is a technique that I generally don't really like doing. Sometimes you have to do it, but I tend to rather not avoid it if I can, in which we would take that sort of dark color and we will literally draw that line in between the two things. Sometimes you got to do it. It takes definitely a steady hand, and you're very likely to touch different parts of the model and also make it so that the line is not very even. So it's going to be like thicker in certain places, thinner in other spots. And of course, that's not really what you want to do. You would really want to get like uniformity down on that department. So this is not one that I like doing, but you have to do it at some points. Another very common way of doing it, and this is another way I don't actually use, is washes. Well, the conventional wash. I'll get to another one a bit later. Like Games Workshop washes. People will do like a base coat or get to your midtones territory, and then they will add a wash, which effectively you place all over the model. And because what a wash will do is that it will fall into the recesses of a miniature, which is cool because then it creates those dark lines and gives you those visual distinctions. Some of the things I don't like about washes are the fact that they're glossy, so they're impacting the way that I am painting because I've got gloss and then I've got matte, and it's not very controlled. I find that washes themselves aren't very controllable or a little tricky to work with. And when you apply them all over the model, they can really muddy or darken everything. And I don't want to do that. I've been spending time painting a model and bringing up its highlights. Putting a wash in it brings everything down in a way that I don't necessarily like. Another way of creating this various elements is with contrast paints, or speed paints for that matter. The concept of speed paints is a bit like a wash, sort of, where you take a light colored miniature, generally going to be like a white-ish kind of color. I've seen some like Wraithbone effect, something like that. And you apply that color to the top of it. And the way it works is much like a wash. It goes into the recesses of a mini, effectively creating darker lines in the recesses and a slightly more transparent but lighter variant color along the major surface areas, this giving you that contrast between those two elements. And so it's meant to be a way for speeding things up. Now, I think this works for people who may be doing more army stuff or trying to get through a lot of miniatures quickly, because it does what it does, it falls into the space, into the recesses. But I have no real first-hand experience with these things. I have absolutely seen people use them and to good effect, but I haven't got that experience. One of the ways that I was taught about how to approach framing or dark lining is building up layers. You have to think about it like this. Normally we start when we do our base coat, it's going to be probably the darkest color that we are working with. And so each subsequent layer that we go above it is going to be brighter in its tone or in its color. And so as long as we are painting in a smaller space than the original space that we're painting over, so if the base color is, a certain area, we're painting in a smaller area and we build that up, then the base color exists still, which means that's the dark line. So if, for instance, we are working with two elements, say like leather and skin, whatever base color that I have that sits between those two is going to be there as long as I'm building up my highlights and I don't touch that recess. And as long as that recess stays sort of like untouched by paint, the dark line already exists. And so I don't need to do anything. Those lines are already there for me, which is actually pretty cool. And because it works exactly with the way that we build layers up generally, as long as you take that into account, you are naturally building those dark lines. And now there's one last one that I've got for defining your model, which is called an oil wash. Now, oil wash is a pretty new thing to me, but something I have been working with. Firstly, you're going to need oil paints. So if you have to go in this direction, and you're also going to need like odorless spirit and stuff like that. If you bring it down to sort of a wash level in consistency, very watery and stuff like that, it works very much like a wash, except that it has a lot more control, which is what I really like about it. Because it works much like a wash, where it wants to go into the recess, If we take our brush and we're careful with the oil, we can literally poke it into a recess and it will spread only in the recessed area, which is great. So if you utilize a very dark brown or very, not black, but close to, then we can create those dark lines almost very, very simply, very easily. I have found that it's like really nice. It works very, very well. And it's really straightforward. And the nice thing about the wash part of it, or the oil side of it, is that you can actually take it off, especially if you get it elsewhere. All you need to do is use a little bit of the spirit and you can rub it away. So if you get a little bit like messy with it, you can clean it up afterwards. It won't even impact anything about the acrylic paint that you worked with. It won't take it off or anything like that. So you can be very liberal with it and not have to fear about your paint job prior to that point. It's almost like you're letting the paint do the work for you, rather than you having to like be meticulous in drawing a line around the element. So the oil wash is, I think, a very nice and useful tool to have in your arsenal when you need to be able to do dark lines. There is no one right way to do framing. Partly because there are different ways you come to this point, and it's a bit tricky to say. Like, if we're building up layers appropriately, then you already have your dark lines that exist there and you don't need to go backwards on it. But if you're, like, say, utilizing an airbrush and you're doing it on a Space Marine, and say, let's just talk about red Space Marine, for instance, and I prime it, or I get to the color that I'm looking for, like a nice red, well, all the recessed armor points are red at this moment in time, and I need to then go backwards and dark line them. So we need to utilize these different techniques because of the various different approaches that we have to painting. So let's get to edge highlighting. Edge highlighting is very common. Actually, it's a fundamental technique that you absolutely have to get down so you can take your painting further. If we look back into old Games Workshop style painting, it's very obvious to see this, edge highlighting technique. At its absolute basics, we are just defining or adding light to an edge. How do we do this? Well, we are going to take our paintbrush, we are going to thin our paint down to its regular consistency. We don't want to have too much water here, and I can stress this because if it's too much water, it'll flow too quickly and it will actually make things a little harder for you. So I find that it's a little easier with just a slightly drier brush rather than a overly wet brush. And you take the flat side of your brush rather than, say, the point, and then you run it along the edge. And with practice of this, you can consistently get down a fairly straight sort of bead of paint along that edge, where it's not like a bit gloopy in one area, a bit fat in one spot, and very thin in another area. Again, anything like this just takes practice, but it's absolutely doable. Edge highlighting is obviously a fundamental technique, but where to apply it can kind of leave us in a sort of like, where should I put it? When is it important? How best to utilize it? Well, I would say edge highlighting is important when you need to apply it to the areas that are the most important in a miniature. If we like to think about the concept of light and where it comes from, then we want to create that glint on the edges of armor and things like that, or around the edges, especially armor or swords of that nature. We want that to be where we think the light is coming from and catching that edge. That's kind of the whole point of an edge highlight. What colors you utilize is a much more complicated topic. Firstly, it always depends on the material you're utilizing, taking into account that leather is not going to be as shiny as metal. So you would never get to a bright light as you would get with leather. Leather will always be much more muted in comparison. But to really hone and take your edge highlighting to higher levels, you want to be thinking of it like layering. You're building smaller and smaller, you're painting in smaller and smaller areas as you go brighter and brighter. So let's think of a armor panel, just like that. Let's think it's a square, for an instance. And the light's coming from this angle this way. This top here could be brighter than, say, this bottom part. So you might want to think that all the brightest points, the brightest highlights you're going to be utilizing this edge highlighting technique will be brighter on the top side of any edge rather than the bottom side. That's at least a good way to kind of get a sense about where and how to place certain things. But obviously with more practice, you can get a better understanding of where you think it looks more appropriate. So if framing is the recesses, edge highlighting is the raised edges of those parts. They're sitting literally right next to each other, generally separated via either some height difference or a separation in element of whatever the two things might be. And so we are utilizing the recess and this top edge, or this raised edge, to create the visual distinction. With the edge highlighting aspect, we're going to generally go brighter than the base color of whatever piece that we're painting. So we have a leather strap. This base color here is going to be brown, okay, because brown is leather for the most part. And on the sides, or on the edges, we will paint it, say, in a tan, something brighter than that base color. So what it does is it creates the visual distinction that, yes, this is leather, but now we've got the edge that helps to define the entire leather strap. And if we've got dark lines that run along the side of it, the leather strap now is separated from whatever the other armor element is. So all parts of it come together to create separation, visual distinction, which allows our eyes to understand what we are looking at that much better. Let's continue with that example. If I've got a strap like so, and I've got the dark lines in the recesses, I've got the highlights along the raised edges, and if the light's coming from above, what I could do is then make this top side brighter and make the bottom side darker. Still utilizing edge highlighting, but I could consider making this a brighter color to create that even additional separation of where light might be landing. How bright it is really up to the sense of where light placement's going to be, and that gets more advanced. That's like you're getting into topics that are to do with light, getting to do with the positions of models and what you are trying to accentuate. And so what you could end up doing is if you take a model and you edge highlight everything exactly the same color, the entire model will look very samey. It won't look like it's in an environment. It just looks separated. Though we've been talking about this conceptually, I want to show you all, hopefully with some examples of different things to help give you a sense about this visual distinction. I painted this Terminator fairly early on in my painting journey, and I painted it like how I think most people would start out, you know? It's a base color, and then I did an edge highlight on every single part, utilizing a type of orange to give it visual distinction. And I didn't even use it very brightly, but it is there at least. And I went around with a paintbrush, drawing in hopefully very thin, dark lines between all those elements to try and separate it. Now, I could do much better now, and I know more tips and tricks to be able to pull that off, but it's still there, and it kind of gives a sense, but you can see that it's less of what I'm able to do today and just shows a bit of the journey of where I've come from. You can see in places there I didn't do it as well. If I take a look at his shoulder pad, between the gray and the red, I don't actually have a dark line between the two. Yes, they're visually distinct because there's gray and there's red, but if I placed a dark line between those two things, then there would be significant more pop between the two. And that generally in miniatures is a better thing rather than a worse thing. If we continue on, here's a model I painted later on afterwards, me trying to do a 75mm miniature. If we take a look, now you can see where this would have been an actual total bastard to have done, is all the scales on his armor down here around his waist. You can see that I did not visually define every single scale. You might go, whoa, Nelly, I don't want to be doing that. But if I did, the scale armor would look so much better and be so much more apparent to what it is rather than what it is like literally. Like I can look at it and I go, oh, I can see that it scales because I can look at it. But if I painted it, in a way where it was actually every single scale was defined, it would look amazing. Moving on from some of the early things more into later territory, say for instance this Kingsman from Kingdom Death, each armor element, be it from his non-metallic metal silverish armor to the non-metallic metal gold that we're dealing with, there is going to be a dark line that sits between those things, allowing your eye to visually see that each element is different. And even between different silver parts, there are going to be black or darkish lines, because now I realize how important it is to create the visual distinction. Even with leather, you can kind of see maybe where it's not quite as good is around the handle where this gentleman's holding it, because he's a gentleman, is that if I defined these lines even better, it would look much more like cloth, or the cloth would look visually more distinct from every element. And so it's important to be aware of it, at least, because now that we've got it in our mind, the more that we paint, the more we begin to understand or see the differences between these things, and we can grow as a painter. And really, at the end of the day, that's what we all want to do, at least, for the most part. Sure, we want to paint things quickly, but creating visual pop is important, especially from distance, because we want to be able to have a very readable model. If we take, for instance, this piece of armor here, you can see that each of the kind of like metallic bits are separated, like this. I think there's like a little chevron type thing. Each one of them has outlined from each other, which is a bit of a pain, truthfully. But at least when you look at it, you're like, I can immediately tell that they're plates. And that's what we're trying to do. So when both of them work in tandem, creating those dark lines and those edge highlights, you create better distinction, which I keep saying, like a broken record at this point in time. And I think it comes together quite well with this model, showcasing what you can achieve when you start getting both of those elements working in tandem. They're complementary, they are opposites. Framing is the shadow, the dark lines between things, and edge highlighting is the bright points along the edges, and that contrast, well, that helps create visual pop. So I hope that this bit of information, this sort of conversation about this, has been at least helpful. It's obviously painting is it's like not crazy complicated, but there's definitely complexities that exist within the field, and learning and gaining that understanding is such a vital, important piece to being able to improve and move on as painters, especially when we look at it and just understanding it when we visualize these things. Please press the like, subscribe, and leave some comments if you things that you're interested in, see more stuff. We want to have a conversation about this whole subject. We want to do more videos. It's important to us. We've been enjoying it, even if it's hard work, and hopefully it shows with the content that we are creating. So with that, adios, amigos.